Welcome back to Ambivalent Offenders. This is Erin, and I am joined by my favorite, not just an adjective, but my royal favorite, my husband, Matt. Hi.
Hi, everybody. Boy, that's a testament to the power of the comma, isn't it? 'Cause if you said my favorite husband, that connotes
And
something
you're
totally
also
different.
my favorite husband. You're the best husband I've ever had.
So I'm your husband and I'm the court favorite.
You are.
Wow. Okay. That's a lot of pressure. I will try to live up
I
to that.
also want to put you in charge of foreign policy. I have a hankering. I hope you're okay with that. You'll probably, spoiler alert, do better than George Villiers.
Oh, we have a little bit of foreshadowing there.
We do. And we do have a long show for you guys. A lot to get to today. So I'm going to keep things brief at the top. I just want to remind you to like, rate, subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on Instagram, on the gram, to get previews of who we're covering next and a lot of other fun stuff. Lastly, we do have a Patreon for those who do want more content as well. That's always linked in the show notes. I have some things in the works for that. So patrons, look out in a fun, not a dangerous way. I'm not threatening you. It's just there's some fun stuff that hopefully we can cover over on the Patreon. So with all that business, let's dive back into the story.
Okay, tell us where we left off.
Yeah, so just a note before I do get started, any quotes that I give will be from the book that I read as part of the research. The book is Scapegoat, The Brilliant Brief Life of the Duke of Buckingham by Lucy Hughes Hallett. Very good. I will say it starts off slow, but the back half is just amazing, reads like a novel. You can't put it down. And I did not either. I stayed up way too late reading multiple nights. But anyway, we left off with George Villiers, the hot young boyfriend of the king, King James, befriending the awkward young Prince Charles, who was the son and heir of his lover. There was a little bit of a hint at the end that this newfound friendship would lead to one of the stranger episodes in George Villiers' life, and frankly, in English and British history. It's one of the weirdest stories that I've ever encountered. And I read a lot of history, so that says a lot. This had to do with Prince Charles's potential marriage to the sister of the King of Spain, the Infanta. They call the princesses of Spain the Infanta. The marriage talks had been dragging on for a while, with seemingly no end or marriage in sight. Into this complex web of diplomatic negotiations stepped our dynamic duo, George Villiers and Prince Charles. Even now, people remain absolutely baffled by their plan. It seems like it could have benefited from another round or 2 or 5 of brainstorming. To be fair, if we want to be generous to George, it seems like the idea came from the prince, not him. But still, it does not reflect well on George's intelligence or political savvy that he went along with it and did not find a way to improve upon it.
Okay, tell me about this plan.
The plan, the two of them would secretly travel to Spain in disguise with no entourage to personally seal a marriage deal that had taken years of delicate, careful diplomacy. Screw the careful work of ambassadors. Who needs ambassadors when you have 2 overly confident bros? George and Prince Charles had vibes to bring to the table.
Oh, this sounds familiar.
Yeah, it makes it even worse when you realize that the reason that Prince Charles and George wanted to speed up negotiations, it was what King James called the, quote, codpiece point. Shy, awkward little Charles concocted this whole plan because he was anxious to have sex. That's what he wanted. He was getting older. He was already 22 years old in 1623. And he wanted his bride now. He couldn't wait any longer. Charles had also convinced himself that he was in love with the Infanta, despite never having met her. This is where I would say, my God, Charles, you would have been so susceptible to catfishing. He would have sent So much money to fake women on the internet. God love him. Of course, I'm sure you can already see the issues with this plan, and it is kind of generous to even call it a plan. One of the issues, travel, was exceptionally dangerous in those days. Shipwrecks were common. Then you add in the threat of disease, robbery, any number of hazards along the way. They would be going through France, too, to get to Spain, another Catholic power that was notoriously never friendly with England. If there's one thing anybody knows, it's France and England never get along, or rarely get along.
Traditionally rivals, understatement.
Going without a large protective entourage would put young Prince Charles at risk. And at this point, King James had already lost his first heir, Henry. Henry had died young of disease. So Charles was the only remaining son and heir. If James did not want a succession crisis, he had to keep Prince Charles safe and cocooned. Number 2, if the dynamic duo arrived safely, and that was a big if, again, point 1, Prince Charles would essentially be a hostage in Spain. He would be willingly making himself one, too. You wanted a hostage? Coming right up, here I am. Not exactly great news for his dad. Spain and England still had a pretty tense relationship. The Spanish Armada wasn't that long ago. And the religious tensions, with Spain being uber Catholic and England Protestant, were just one of the many reasons the marriage alliance had hit a snag. So Charles would end up a hostage in a hostile land. So it's not even like he's a hostage in a place that particularly liked Englishmen.
Can I ask a stupid question?
Yeah.
Aside from all the other miscalculations that you've just described, aren't they going to just stick out? I mean, you have these 2 Englishmen who don't speak the language, but somehow have enough money to travel.
You are already asking more questions than Charles and George did.
Oh, wow. Maybe I should be in charge of foreign policy.
Yes, I think you're already a step ahead. We'll talk about how they at least attempt to hide who they are. So stay tuned for that.
And I guess to contextualize this for people, we probably need to remind them that Spain at this point is very much the European superpower, and their claims territorially extend all the way through the Americas,
the Netherlands,
the Philippines. They have their flag flies in what's now parts of Holland and Germany.
Which we'll talk a little bit about that, because that does clash up against some of King James's family. So we're going to come back to that. England is just a tiny little piece of, they're just a little island, and Spain is not. Spain is a superpower.
So in an odd sort of way, 2 questions. Is this reminiscent of the previous royal house, the Tudors, trying to get Henry VII's children married into the Spanish dynasty as well?
A little bit. You mean, why did they want to marry into Spain?
And from the
prestige.
Well, no, that's not what you pointed to first. First, you said it was just that Charles really wanted to have sex.
That's part of it.
Which, I mean, there's probably other avenues available to him.
Exactly.
Than recruiting the Spanish princess. When I was a young man and wanted to have sex, I don't recall reaching out to the Spanish consulate.
You better not have. Otherwise, I'm going to go to war with Spain right now. No. You would be right. You would think, why is a prince waiting till marriage? Well, that makes no sense. That's just who Charles was. He's very awkward. His older brother, Henry, who had died at this point, he had been a ladies' man. He had slept with women in the court. Charles does not do any of that. He is quite literally waiting for marriage. So he is saving himself for his Spanish princess. He knows that's the plan. So he's like, let's speed some things up. I'm in my 20s. It is a particular problem for a particular man. In most cases, this would not be the situation. The prince would be sleeping with anything that moved. Not in this case. This is just who Charles is.
Okay. So he is in Spain
Well, not yet. Not yet. First, they have to ask dear old dad.
Oh, that's right. Right. We're going to back up now and see if Dad is on board. He should veto this.
He's been king for a very long time. He knows how these things go. So you're going to ask, how the hell did George Villiers and Prince Charles manage to get King James to agree to this? They trapped him, plain and simple. First, they made King James swear to support them. It's like the classic, Dad, I've got something to tell you, but you have to promise not to be mad. They said, Dad. And remember, George did call him Dad. So it's Dad from both of them. Dear Dad, we have a plan. You have to agree. Before we even tell you anything, you have to say yes. And James loves them. He loves George. He loves Charles. So he says yes. Of course, once he heard it, King James, who was no dummy, went through all the scenarios that we laid out, and he became inconsolable. The next day, a whole drama played out, and it really showed how much had changed since George Villiers first came to court. When George and Prince Charles went to see King James, he broke down in a, quote, storm of weeping. He told them no. Whatever he'd said before, they could not go to Spain. He worried about the safety of his son, both personally as a father, but also as a king who needed his heir. Again, there's no more sons. This is his only son. He also worried that George would make himself even more unpopular with this whole trip. Up until now, George Villiers had been subservient, as expected, to the king. We talked about how he learned at his side, supported him. But at this point, he was 30 years old, no longer a novice at court. And it seemed like he had switched allegiances, at least politically, to Prince Charles. From here on out, King James was outnumbered 2-1. George no longer deferred like he once had. It is really striking to see how this plays out. The favorite now looked like he was the one in charge. George Villiers practically berated the king after the old man had spoken his mind about the trip, something George would have never dared before. To pull a line from the book, quote, something had changed. The king was being bullied. His sweet boys were now in league against him, end quote. At the end, King James flung himself on his bed, bereft, beaten down. He knew that there was no way this was going to end well, but he let them go all the same. He had given them his promise.
The die was cast.
The die was cast. The details about George and Prince Charles's trip sound like something out of a buddy comedy. It's buddy comedy 17th century style. They wore fake beards, which fooled absolutely no one. I can only imagine what kind of low-rent playhouse type fake beards they wore. The disguises only made them more suspicious, not less, and they were almost taken into custody to be questioned, as the locals thought they must be up to no good. You see these people in these fake disguises, they're like, oh, they must be bandits, they must be something. At some point, a mayor of a town even claimed to have warrants for their arrest from the Privy Council, which made them laugh. Eventually, George dropped the charade, removed the beard, and told the mayor he was actually visiting a fleet incognito to assess its readiness. That's why he was in disguise.
Now, I did a little bit of digging about this. Do you know the names they used?
Yes. Jack and Tom Smith.
These are the names that you always use with the hotel clerk if you're wanting to be there and not wanting there to be any record.
When I told you that you already thought more about this than they did, I'm not joking. Yeah, they're Jack and Tom Smith. They were two brothers, just, hitting the open road, off to Spain. You guys put zero forethought into this. The only entourage they had were 3 gentlemen who luckily had more experience in terms of diplomacy. They had chosen well in terms of their companions. That was the one thing that made King James rest a little bit easier. Of course, none of these men really wanted to be there, and they knew this whole trip was doomed to be a failure. Still, one could not say no to George Villiers and Prince Charles. I'm just picturing multiple times these men staring at a camera in a mockumentary, wondering how the fuck they ended up here playing pauper. There's so many times throughout this that you're like, oh, guys, I feel for you. Several times along the journey, people who had met George and the prince were certain they had just recognized them. They keep running into people who had seen George and Prince Charles before, and they're like, hey, I'm pretty sure that's George Villiers and Prince Charles. The King James did wisely write ahead to the King of France, Louis XIII, to let him know the prince would be passing through, because he knew that rumors would catch up with them, and they did. He did not want the French king to think a conspiracy was afoot, especially as the relationship between Catholic France and Protestant England was, if not outright hostile, at least tense. So he was really worried, as you would be, that if the King of France learned that the Prince of Wales was in France, that he would think, oh, is he trying to get a rebellion? There's all these religious tensions already in France between the Catholics and the Protestants, also known as the Huguenots. So there's already this tension in France. And then you have, a Protestant prince showing up in the land. You could see where, if he wasn't warned, things could get messy. Then you add to the fact that it was bad form to visit another country as a prince without showing the proper respect, something the dynamic duo naturally had not bothered to consider in their planning. They should have been going to the palaces, being received with their entourage. Obviously, that's not happening. While in Paris, George and Charles upgraded their disguises, buying themselves fancy periwigs, fashionable with the French. It's the wigs that you picture when you think of Louis XIV. It's just like that. They're upgrading. Out with the mustaches and with the wigs. It was not an official visit. Again, they were still incognito, but they were among the crowd like any visitor to the public spaces in the palace, where the masses could gawk at the royals like visiting a very fancy zoo. I think that's what people don't realize, that in this time there were public and private spaces, I guess, just as there are now. If you go to Windsor Castle in England, there are places where the royals actually live, and the more public spaces here, you could go and you could visit. You could see the king eating. Not very exciting, but people went to see their king eating dinner.
Exciting. I guess, there's no radio or television or TikTok.
Yeah, they don't really have much else to do. So it's like, well...
Ooh, scrambled eggs today. Mark it in your diary.
Not much else to do, so let's go over to the palace. They did see the French ambassador in London. He was the one in England representing France. They saw him there at the palace, so close call. But luckily, the wigs did their job and the pair were not recognized. Prince Charles even watched the Spanish Infanta's sister Anne dance. She was the Queen of France, which made him even more anxious to get his own marriage deal done. We get it, Charles. You are horny. Take it down several notches. This man, of course, again, he's the one royal who refused to sleep with ladies of the court or sex workers. It might have made him more patient if he had. In fact, Charles was so focused on the Queen that he did not seem to notice the 14-year-old sister of the King of France, Henrietta Maria, who would actually be his future bride. Therese, old spoiler alert, the Spanish match does not go through. All this time, too, while the men were traveling back in England, the king was trying to make excuses for where the heir and the favorite were. These were very visible men. They couldn't just vanish from court and their houses and there not be questions. He's trying to put up the questions. Again, poor King James. 2 weeks after setting out, they finally arrived in Spain, and on the doorstep of the ambassador, the Earl of Bristol, was around 8 p.m., and the household had settled in for the evening. George, calling himself, again, Mr. Smith, sent word that the ambassador needed to come down and meet him at the door. Instead, the Earl sent his nephew, who took one look and recognized the favorite immediately. You can hear him saying, his voice getting a little high, "You're gonna want to come down here." The Earl of Bristol, for his part, was both baffled and deeply stressed. Not only did he have the king's closest advisor and love there, carrying his own luggage, he had the heir to the throne who was waiting outside all by himself on the street. Just to put this in context, nighttime in a cosmopolitan city in Madrid, where they were, or Paris, that's dangerous. If you're alone on the street, even as a man, you could be robbed, you could be any number of things. So just having the Prince of Wales hanging out all by himself on the street is dangerous just there.
He's vulnerable. This is really reckless.
All the careful plotting over the course of years out the window. The ambassador knew Spain. He knew its customs. Now he would be sidelined by two men who knew nothing. Nothing except for their own playful hubris. In a world without Xanax, I can only hope that the ambassador tucked himself into bed with a bottle of wine that night. Because boy, he was going to need it. The next few months would become stressful for everybody involved. It would be a battle of the royal favorites on the English and Spanish sides. A new royal favorite has entered the villa. Let's meet George Villiers' counterpart.
Ooh.
The Spanish delegation was led by the king's minister, Don Gaspar de Guzman, the Count Duke of Olivares. This is where I will say, I don't speak Spanish. I took French in high school and college. You did take Spanish, so you could probably say it way better than I did. If you want to give your best Spanish, you can.
I think you're doing fine. I suppose we should, for the Spanish-speaking listeners, we should say we do know it would be the Infanta.
Yeah.
As to Infanta.
It's both my slight Chicago accent and my lack of Spanish. I'm not trying to make fun. That's what my mouth does. It's Infanta and Olivares. That's what you get.
It'd be Olivares.
Olivares? Okay.
Yeah, you're doing fine. And not that I'm still a white guy using his 5 years of Spanish from 30 years ago. But I think that's how you'd do it.
Still better than me. When the previous king of Spain had died, reportedly, Olivares said, "Now everything is mine." He was not wrong. Some compared him to Atlas, who held the world in his hands. Think of him as Cardinal Mazarin or Cardinal Richelieu, who we will meet later on, ruling in the stead of a young, inexperienced king. In terms of personalities, the two favorites could not have been more different. Lacking the glamour and attractiveness of his English counterpart, the 36-year-old Olivares comes across as a deeply serious man, a hard worker with an explosive temper that could be triggered at any moment. He could be scary. This was a man who had not used his beautiful looks to get to the top of the court food chain. He had done it all through the force of will and working without pause. It was said he worked 18 hours a day. Bravo. You got to give it up to that man. I don't want to call George Villiers stupid, but he was greatly outmatched. Whatever political hurdles he'd faced in England, none of it prepared him for these negotiations. He had none of the cunning and art of deception that Olivares had mastered, agreeing to one thing but doing another. While the visit started off promising, it would soon go downhill from there. The book states that George, quote, was to find that negotiating with his Spanish counterpart was frustrating, infuriating, and sometimes, when the Count Duke unleashed his temper, very frightening, end quote. By the time George mercifully left, or was allowed to leave, Spain, he would come to loathe Olivares. The main point of contention was and continued to be the religious differences between Prince Charles and the Infanta. While King James Prince Charles and even George all acted as if this could be overcome, even without either party converting. The Spanish were clear that that was never going to happen. Sorry. Not happening. The Spanish had no intention of making a match with a country full of heretics. They were never going to let their Infanta go to England unless Charles converted. And Charles could not be King of England and a Catholic. This is key. He can't be King of England and a Catholic because he's going to be the head of the Church of England.
Right. I don't know if we can unpack the whole history of the Protestant Reformation in England in the space of this podcast. I think the way to try to do it in capsule form, although I bet a bunch of our listeners are already very fluent in this.
Henry VIII.
That's you wouldn't be listening to this kind of podcast if you didn't have a little bit of grounding in it. But basically, in their world, they don't have these compartments for piety and patriotism. Religion and politics are fundamentally integrated, and the English world, or we can now say, since we're in the Stuart period, the British universe, the head of the church is also the chief of state. Technically here we go again. You push your glasses up against your nose and say, actually
me.
The Archbishop of Canterbury is supposed to be kind of the executive head of the Anglican Church, but structurally, this is true even today. The other Charles, the current Charles, King Charles.
That's why every time I say Prince Charles and King Charles, I think of our current one. I'm sorry.
Now, that's not fair. He waited a long time.
I know.
You should let him be king. But he is not just the king. He's also the head of the Church of England.
People were, way back when, they were like, can he be divorced and be the head of the Church of England? Sorry, babes. Yes, he can, because Henry VIII was divorced and head of the Church of England. But yes, it's both king and head of a religion. You can see why he can't convert.
Right.
And we will see, spoiler to the future, that when a king of England is Catholic, they're booted off the throne.
Or even, suspected of it.
Yes.
And that's, it's kind of a distant parallel. It's sort of like a service road on the highway from where we are. But if you think about the 1960 presidential campaign, that was the first of only 2 times that somebody was on the road to the White House who was Roman Catholic. And Kennedy had to make public addresses on 2 separate occasions that, if elected, he would govern from the dictates of his own conscience and not, take calls from the Vatican telling him how to respond to the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Civil Rights Act.
Which is crazy. So you think that it was like that in 1960. So go back 300 years and yeah, it's the same thing. To be fair, the Pope, too, had already refused to give dispensation to the Infanta to marry unless Prince Charles converted, which this declaration by the Pope was kept a secret because if Spain came out and said that, then the negotiations would end. There would be no hope forward, so they kept that in their back pocket. Add to that, the previous king of Spain, on his deathbed, had made his heir swear to, quote, never permit the marriage between the Infanta Maria and Prince Charles unless the British would agree to all Spain's demands, including the prince's conversion and the repeal of all anti-Catholic legislation in James's kingdoms, end quote. Those 2 points are going to be huge. That's the reason things had stalled. A deathbed demand, you can see how hard that's going to be to overcome. At first, the Spanish felt that perhaps King James and the prince were willing to play ball. They assumed that Prince Charles suddenly arriving in their kingdom, they thought that meant he was willing to convert to Roman Catholicism, which you don't blame them. They're like, why else would suddenly he show up? This is not how marriage negotiations go. The prince doesn't just show up, so they'd soon find out, no, he was just a dumb boy led by, It's almost like Prince Charles and George underestimated the religious question. They were not hardliners themselves, so they expected the Spanish to be the same. The prince was more than willing to marry a Catholic, even if he would not become one.
Because, Spain in the 17th and 16th century, it's known for just being
so flexible,
extraordinarily open and flexible.
That is exactly what you think of when you think of Spanish Catholicism. Yeah. Again, this is where you go back to. They did no research. They did no thinking ahead of time. They expected everybody felt the same way that they did. Again, Prince willing to marry a Catholic, even if he's not going to become one. And then George also, he's Protestant, but his wife, we talked about last time, had been a Catholic, had been forced to convert to marry him. And his mother was at least flirting with Catholicism. She was surrounding herself with Jesuits. It was sort of a big deal at court. People had thought that perhaps that would oust him from being the favorite, but it did not. And his mother, Mary, was still in favor as well with the king. So the Spanish, they sensed an opening. They attempted to persuade the prince to convert. The Spanish king told the prince and favorite, if they did not at least hear arguments in favor of Catholicism, listen to the theologians they had lined up, the marriage deal was at an impasse. So the theological discussion went ahead. It went so poorly that George fled the room, tearing his hat off his head and stomping on it. Of course, the discussion did not convince the prince to convert. If anything, it hardened George and Prince Charles even more, and the chaplains that the king had sent along were not even allowed to enter the palace. As you can start to see, the Spanish plan was becoming a disaster, a slow-moving train wreck. And with hindsight and historical discoveries, we know the match was what the book calls a chimera. So it was never going to happen. Spain only wanted to drag out the negotiations as long as possible so that England would not go over to France for a bride. So they were just stalling. They had no intention of making a match, and it became deeply embarrassing for George and Prince Charles. They quickly realized they could be showered with as many gifts and as much pomp as custom demanded for visiting royalty. Honored in the over-the-top way, royals honored their own. But they were hostages held in a gilded cage. They lived in the Spanish palace with great expense, so much so that the Venetian ambassador joked that the prince had, quote, managed to sack the city without an army, end quote. But this meant that they were being watched at all times, including having Spanish gentlemen serving Prince Charles, effectively spying on him. While they were not prisoners in the classic sense, any mention of returning home was met with an insistence from the King of Spain that they had to stay. Please stay. You have to stay. It's at my insistence. It was exactly what King James had feared. Well, George's patience had begun to run out in Madrid, so did his health. The king had sent down to Spain the full entourage that should have gone with the prince in the first place. Now, many in the English entourage fell ill, especially with the heat in Madrid. So they're there during the peak of summer, June, July, August. Heat stroke became a major concern. Even George was not immune. He was forced to remain indoors in his quarters, going out in a sedan chair if needed. George Villiers, used to an easy life of being liked and fawned over, was having an absolutely miserable time. What had come so easy to George in England was failing him now. The Spanish thought he was overdressed and were shocked at how intimate his relationship with the prince was. He reportedly called Charles Baby Charles, which I don't even know where to begin with that. I love it. I don't think I called him Baby Charles in the first part, but I might have. I could have, so I love it. George supposedly had affairs while in Spain, setting more tongues wagging, some even accusing him of sleeping with Olivares' own wife. Unlikely. Unlikely there. Some even said he brought prostitutes in the palace. These types of rumors followed George wherever he went, so it makes it really hard to tell fact from fiction. But as a man accustomed to being liked, of using his charm to win people to his cause, George's unpopularity in Spain left him snippy and short-tempered to those around him. He could not handle not being liked. His relationship with Olivares nosedived, as we mentioned, and he fought often with the poor Earl of Bristol, the ambassador tasked with the Spanish match. At least George still had his king. So the two were still writing letter after letter to each other. King James even wore a portrait miniature of his favorite under his waistcoat next to his heart, which is so cute and romantic and sad. It's when George was in Madrid that we got those letters about the bedpost and thinking about his daddy's legs, which we're not going to go back there. I can't go back there. It does show the depth of their affection that in George's absence, there was no hint of a new boy toy, someone to keep James company. James only wanted his George. In his loneliness, the king bestowed upon his Steenie, his George, the biggest gift yet. He would now be the Duke of Buckingham. I think in some of the stuff on Instagram, I've called him the Duke of Buckingham already, but he was just the Earl before. Now he is the full-blown Duke. And this was a really big deal because George would be the only non-royal Duke in the land. The other Dukes were King James's own sons. So he could go no higher in the hierarchy except to be king himself. It must have lifted George's spirits, if only temporary, because at some point he would need to find a way out of Spain. Yes, Prince Charles continued to moon over the Infanta, learning Spanish, effectively stalking her. Olivares was actually creeped out at the way Prince Charles seemed to stalk her, want to see the Infanta even just from a distance. When that man fixated, he really fixated. But the favorite and the prince, they had to go home at some point. Or at least they hoped that they could go home at some point. It had been, at this point, about 4 months. The stalemate ended with controversy. We're still not quite sure why George and Prince Charles did what they did. Olivares and the Vatican put forth terms for the dispensation. For every royal marriage, you had to get a dispensation from the Pope. If you're Catholic, just said that you guys were allowed to marry. A lot of times these families were closely linked in terms of family inbreeding, i.e. inbreeding. So they had to get Pope to tell them it was okay. Basically, the Spanish and the Vatican, they schemed and they're like, we're going to put forth terms so bad that the English, they're never going to agree to this. Again, stalling. There's no way. We don't want our Infanta to go there, so we're not going to put forth ones that they're going to agree to. It called for free and public exercise of Catholicism in Great Britain, approved by Parliament. You can just see Olivares laughing, knowing there's no fucking way they could agree to it. It would ruin the entire Stuart monarchy if they did. In the future, even the hint of being somewhat okay with Catholicism would ruin the Stuart monarchy. We know that King James had gotten word from those in the English party that had returned home about how bad things were and about the outrageous demands. The king at this point was aghast. It was, once again, confirming all his worst fears. He knew this. This is why he had not wanted them to go. The trip hadn't just been a complete and utter failure. Now, the two people he loved most were stuck in either out of sheer stubbornness or refusal to see the writing on the wall. They didn't seem to realize they were never leaving with a Spanish bride. Prince Charles had even sent a secret letter to his father asking his permission, if it came down to it, to leave Madrid secretly like they had come. That's how desperate they were getting. It's then that King James wrote back to the two to do whatever it took, agree to whatever in order to get back home. His letter says, "Come speedily and give over all treaty. I care for match nor nothing, so I may once have you in my arms again. God grant it. God grant it. Amen, amen, amen." What happens next is both Charles and George agree to the unbelievable terms set forth by the Spanish. The terms that the Spanish thought were so crazy, so out there that they would never agree to. They say yes. This is where people debate why they did it. We know that King James, desperate to get both men back, told them to agree to whatever terms they thought acceptable. Most likely, George Villiers and Charles were just playing a part. It was the only way, again, to secure their exit from Spain. There's some people who say that George and Prince Charles may have genuinely agreed to all demands because the prince was just so hopelessly in love with the Infanta. But as love-struck as Prince Charles was, that seems doubtful. More people think they were just signing whatever they could to leave. The act worked. The King of Spain and Olivares were flabbergasted, but the Spanish public celebrated. It was a real coup for the Catholic Church. Prince Charles and George, they had to play along for another 2 months, signing the treaty, Charles sitting publicly with the Infanta at plays. The Infanta had even begun to learn English for her future role as Queen of England. At last, George and Prince Charles were able to leave. When George said goodbye to Olivares, he told them, quote, "I tell you very frankly that I shall never be a friend to your excellency," quote. I'm sure Olivares was okay with that. As soon as they got out, Prince Charles wrote to the ambassador, the Earl of Bristol, and told him the wedding was off. They were leaving the ambassador to mop up the problem they had created. There's one person to truly feel bad for in this scenario. It's the Earl of Bristol. He was just there. He'd been there for years, even though it looks like it was never going to happen. He was doing his part, and then these two bozos show up. But as embarrassing and bad as the Spanish trip went for George as a statesman, he arrived home a national hero. It seems strange to say that when it had been a complete and utter failure in its goals. But that's the point. It failed. The English, with memories of the Spanish Armada during Queen Elizabeth's reign, hated the idea of a Spanish queen. Excuse me, a Spanish Catholic queen. So they celebrated the Spanish match's demise with bonfires, fireworks, and yes, a shit ton of booze. Londoners burned lard and furniture when the firewood ran out. Men cried in the streets as if the Armada had just been defeated. Every year until the English Civil War, bells would ring out on October 5th to mark that day, like it was marking a victory in war. George would never again achieve such popularity. The country loved him. In contrast, the ambassador of Spain, poor Earl of Bristol, came home to be tried and sat in the Tower of London. Which I know it's maybe too on the nose to talk about fairness in a literal monarchy, but the fact that George and Prince Charles are the ones who bungled the Spanish match and heightened tensions with Spain, it hardly seems fair that the ambassador got the blame, but he did. His diplomatic career was finished. If there's anybody to feel bad for in this story, feel bad for the Earl of Bristol. At some point, I will say, he does get his revenge on George Villiers. George, meanwhile, picked up where he had left off. His reunion with the king had been emotional. Both Prince and George had stayed up until 4 a.m. with King James. However grateful and happy the king was to have his 2 boys back, once George was back on English soil, the relationship between king and favorite was never an easy one. That change that we had seen before he had gone to Spain, it's never undone. George seemed to be firmly now in Prince Charles's camp. King James felt abandoned by his love in favor of the prince. One person at court observed that, "I can see the prince loves him in an extraordinary degree." Prince Charles even called George sweetheart in his letters. Cute. I think we should bring that back. More men calling each other sweetheart.
I'll start.
Okay. That's not toxic masculinity. Start texting your boys, calling them sweetheart. If you're asking, no, it's not a romantic or sexual relationship that we can tell. But it was obviously deep and bonded by the trauma that they had experienced in Spain. What had gone on in Spain that had bonded them, and it would forever. Although, in a lot of ways, them together, it would be the blind leading the blind. That's a little bit more for the future. However, the biggest divide between the king and favorite had to do with what to do next with Spain. Their time in Spain had radicalized George and Prince Charles. They wanted war. They were so embarrassed that they wanted war. So did the English populace. They had celebrated George and Prince Charles's return because they expected war. However, the king still dictated foreign policy, and King James remained committed to peace. This is the first time in their lives that George Villiers and King James were in opposition. It created plenty of political and personal tension. King James already suffered from debilitating illnesses that came and went. Now the man whose return he had longed for made his remaining time left on earth a living hell. The two, the favorite and the king, they couldn't even be in the same room with each other without getting into screaming matches about Spain. And the English public were firmly on George's side. They had been at peace long enough to forget the hazards of war, the draining of the treasury. It's only nations that have avoided war for decades that suddenly find themselves dreaming of armies. They thought only about the days of the Spanish Armada, Francis Drake, Walter Raleigh sticking it to the Spanish. Poor King James knew that giving in would spell ruin for the country, but that desire for war with his own favorite at its head became too much for him to resist. This is when King James launched Parliament, knowing in his heart that the country would come to regret this decision. So they would. The worst was yet to come for the king. He had been told that George and his son, the prince, planned to force him to withdraw into what amounted as retirement. This would then enable the prince to rule with George, of course, at his side. There's probably some truth to this. There's probably had been some discussion about letting the king sort of recede from the public life because, again, his health had greatly declined in the last couple of years.
Like a reverse regency kind of thing?
Most likely there had been discussions, but to the king, who we had talked about in that first part, he had always been paranoid and quick to see plots where there were none. It all sounded like treason.
Well, we can't blame him for that, given his own family history.
You know, in the first couple of years, all of his regents had been killed. And then right when he gets to England, I don't think we mentioned it in the first part, but there was the gunpowder plot, which was meant to blow up him and all of Parliament.
Right. Part 1 had gunpowder all over the place.
Yeah. You can see why when he's told this, he doesn't see it as, oh, we want dear old dad to enjoy the remaining years of his life. No, this sounds like treason. As you can imagine, King James reacted to these rumors with a mix of anger and sorrow. His son and his favorite, they were his closest companions. These are the people he spent all his time with. To think that they were the ones to betray him. So for any betting man, the spring of 1624 seemed to spell doom for George Villiers. The events on St. George's Day of 1624 only showed the fissures in the relationship between the king and his love. The day itself was an important one. If you can remember back in part 1, St. George's Day in 1624, that's the 9th anniversary of when George Villiers joined the king's household, starting his improbable rise to the highest echelons of power. King James was ready to go to Windsor to mark the Order of the Garter alongside his son, Prince Charles. George's favorite went to join them, only to have the king send him away on some errand. Obviously a ploy to keep him away. Such a small thing that George knows something is up. George, knowing all this, wept, which made King James cry, wailing that he was the unhappiest alive to be forsaken by those dearest to him. The king and prince would leave George Villiers on his own, so they just rode away to Windsor. Like any of Henry VIII's wives, George knew he stood on the precipice of ruin. It was a classic Henry VIII move, saying goodbye to either his minister or his wife and then never seeing them again. So perhaps out of the stress of it all, George fell sick. It was noted by someone close to him that, quote, he hath been thrice let blood at least, yet the world thinks he is more sick in mind than body, end quote. It might have been more of like a mental breakdown. God knows. I too would be really stressed in that scenario. We don't know what this illness was. We know that George had not been a well man in Spain, so it does seem like he was prone to periods of poor health, especially in times of stress. We'll see that reoccur. Again, it was probably the stress of his relationship with the king unraveling before his eyes. All that he was, remember, was because of King James. George had seen what happened to Robert Carr, the king's previous favorite, when he fell from favor. George could lose everything if the king moved against him, and that's not even bringing in the emotional strain it must have put on him. We spoke in the first part about how we don't really know how George felt about King James, but it seems like there was some sort of feelings there, as complicated as the situation was. It's the personal, it's the political, and he's feeling the stress. On May 10th, King James was told that George might in fact die from this illness. Luckily for both men, that did not happen. But this brush with death did bring the pair together again. Oh, yeah.
Aww.
Everything's good again.
Sweethearts.
They are. King James, he always liked to play nurse. Back in episode 1, we mentioned how he had fallen in love with Robert Carr after Carr fell from his horse. Now he could care for George. He loved caring for people. Whatever danger George had been in dissipated. So back in favor, George got to work on both war with Spain and getting baby Charles a bride, for real this time. With Spain out of the question, he looked to France. That was the next obvious country. France had an available teenage princess, Henrietta Maria.
Do you have to put it that way? It sounds like you're describing people in a strip mall.
Well, it's kind of how it is.
Or a car dealership.
Do you want the teenage princess, Henrietta Maria? He did. If you remember, in France, baby Charles had ignored Henrietta Maria when they visited Paris. He had seen her dancing. He was too focused on the queen. We'll talk a little bit more in a bit about the French match, but first I want to tackle the first of many ill-fated expeditions set out to make Spain pay. The age-old trope of men getting embarrassed and wanting to wage war to make up for a bruised ego. It was with the counsel of George and baby Charles, that the king sent a mercenary, Ernst von Mansfeld, in a woefully underfunded army to make war with Spain. George saw in Mansfeld a quick fix, someone who could be hired to launch a land campaign to recover the Palatinate. So we haven't mentioned the Palatinate up until now, but it is important, so I do want to take a little time out and talk about it. Do you know about the Palatinate?
Yes, I do. There's a elephant in the room that we haven't talked about with listeners, which is right about the same time that George is ascending to prominence at the Stuart court, the 30 Years' War is starting.
Yeah.
And that's another reason why, from Spain's perspective, when the whole Spanish match drama is dragging out, they basically, by keeping Charles and George, but obviously especially Charles, in Spain, allowing the process to unfold over weeks and weeks and weeks, that prevents England from potentially intervening in the 30 Years' War on behalf of Spain's Protestant rivals in what we would today call Germany, what they would have called the Holy Roman Empire. So that's kind of a deep cut, but that's the context for this.
The Palatinate was a territory that was ruled by King James's daughter, Elizabeth Stuart, and her husband, Frederick. Elizabeth, to put it in context, she's the older sister of baby Charles. When Charles was younger, he was really sickly, and there was a chance that Elizabeth Stuart was going to be the heir. Baby Charles, he survived, so Elizabeth was married off to Frederick in the Palatinate, which is a Protestant territory in what's now southwestern Germany. It made sense. The marriage between Elizabeth and Frederick would ally England with more Protestant powers. It's like what Thomas Cromwell was doing by marrying Anne of Cleves to Henry VIII. Think of it that way. The problem began back in 1619 when the Protestant nobles of Bohemia rebelled against the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor and offered the crown to Frederick. Against all advice, including King James's, his father-in-law, Frederick accepted. It started off so well. Frederick marched into Prague, took the crown, and within a year he was completely routed. The emperor's forces crushed him and he was forced to flee. King James's daughter, Elizabeth, was then known tongue-in-cheek as the Winter Queen, having only ruled for a winter. If it had ended there, that would have been one thing, but the Holy Roman Emperor and his allies didn't just boot Frederick and Elizabeth from Bohemia. They also invaded Frederick's hereditary lands in the Palatinate. With that, Frederick and Elizabeth had lost everything. So now they don't just not only have Bohemia, which they had accepted the crown, they don't even have their lands that they started off with. And Elizabeth in exile with, at the end, she has 13 children, which is crazy. She became a symbol of Protestant martyrdom. This is where England got pulled in. Despite his daughter losing her territory, King James didn't want war with Spain, so he had pushed off any direct conflict to get the Palatinate back. Now, though, George and baby Charles saw the Palatinate as the perfect place to go up against Spain. So the Holy Roman Emperor, like many that came before him, was a Habsburg, so same ruling family as in Spain. So if you know anything about the Habsburgs, it's that they're famously inbred, so much so that they have what's called the Habsburg jaw. Fun fact, Marie Antoinette was a Habsburg. You can see a little bit of her Habsburg jaw in paintings. It's not quite as bad later. They were so inbred that the last Spanish Habsburg, he could barely eat. His jaw was so malformed. If you look up like last Spanish Habsburg, you'll see quite a picture.
We should point out that if you're a fan of 30 Rock, there's a great episode that deals with the last Habsburg, played by the late, great Paul Rubens, I think.
Pee Wee Herman.
And then if you're scientifically inclined, the term for the condition that they wrestled with was mandibular prognathism, which I just learned
crazy.
this morning.
It's not good. They married so many cousins. There's a lot of like niece-uncle marriages too. At some point.
We should also point out that this is totally unfair to the Habsburgs to just lead with this because of all Europe's royal families, and in some ways the fact that they try to amass territory if they can through marriage and negotiation more than through outright war.
At what point?
It's just hard to shake the long term. It has some genetic consequences.
Very bad.
That were
the jaw.
Unfortunate.
Again, look up like if you look up Habsburg jaws, you'll see a lot of examples. Yeah, it's okay if it's like one generation, but when it's a handful of ones, it really goes downhill. But this is where you can start to see the fractures between Parliament and the monarchy, and George Villiers, obviously on the monarchy side. They're starting to become visible. Parliament hated that the king and the favorite, they're bypassing them at every turn. They should have been consulted on the Mansfeld mission and the French marriage negotiations. Instead, it had been the king, the prince, the favorite, making those decisions, shutting Parliament and even the Privy Council out. It was essentially a triumvirate making the greatest decisions in the country. Two of the members were at least royalty, but the third was a middling man from the gentry who had been lifted into a dukedom due to his beautiful face and charming nature. Of course, there's always pride before a fall, to quote the book. Quote, Buckingham, George, was now more powerful than ever before, but in choosing to rule so high-handedly, bypassing Parliament and Council, he was also on the way to losing power's essential props. End quote. Maybe if he had been a little bit better, if he had let in the Council and Parliament, which a lot of these aren't just his decisions, it's also the decisions of James and then Charles, but it's starting to create a lot of tension with Parliament that will come out later in this episode and in our next episode. Already, some were beginning to second-guess their desire for war and to take back the Palatinate. By the end of 1624, the little triumvirate had already burned through a quarter of the subsidy Parliament had approved. And Mansfeld hadn't even set out yet, so they had a fourth of the money and they hadn't even begun the mission. King James got an anonymous letter begging him to return to his old peace policy because, quote, those very tongues which did cry war, war, war would now curse him that urgeth for one poor subsidy to raise a war. So war, England was finding out, was expensive. Who would have thought? Who would have ever thought?
Which is why James was opposed.
This is, again, where James should have said, I told you so. I told you you would regret it. Perhaps it would have been better for everybody if the Mansfeld mission to retake the Palatinate had not gone ahead. If the Spanish match was an embarrassment, this was a disaster. Poorly funded, poorly supplied, and poorly planned, Mansfeld expedition barely got off the ground, in a pattern that would repeat itself with many of George's planned expeditions. More men died of starvation and disease than in battle. An English officer wrote in a letter, "We die like dogs." Mansfeld would continually write back to George asking for more money to pay his troops, to buy supplies. There was no money. The expedition meant to prove that England was a formidable power on par with Catholic Spain and France, had ended without any tangible results. And if you thought George Villiers might have learned a lesson from this foreign debacle, you would be mistaken. Of course. There's going to be a lot more lessons to learn, and he won't learn any of them. Poor James, not only had he been bullied into a war that he had spent his entire reign avoiding, his health faltered. Illness seemed to be only followed by more illness. Some of it was exacerbated by his always heavy drinking. The king couldn't even sign the French marriage articles for horny baby Charles and Henrietta Maria.
Oh, he's gone from sweet baby Charles to horny baby Charles.
He couldn't even sign it because of the arthritis in his hands.
So this is really the tragedy of a man who, he's the first Stuart to sit on the throne, and he's trying to secure his legacy.
Yeah, it's hard to be the first of a dynasty.
And he's watching everything that he thought he had put in motion. I mean, many of the things he put in motion were very cautious agendas.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm sure left to his own devices, he would have preferred to watch the 30 Years' War unfold without participating, even economically.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that he had held out even when his daughter got run out of her kingdom. It's like he had made it this far.
And he knows that conflict over religious faith has cut the Holy Roman Empire in two.
In the future, maybe not quite now, we're at the brink, but in the next couple decades, France is going to be decimated.
So the last thing he wants to do is bring that to his own country. And yet now all these things are in motion where you can almost imagine if he's brought back to life Well, actually, if he were brought back to life 30 or 40 years down the road, he would see, oh, the monarchy is gone. But that I don't want us to get. Spoiler alert, it's not really part of our podcast.
No.
But Charles the First will not be able to. Oh, I hate to put it this way, but his reign will be cut short.
It will be, as will his life and other things. I do have Charles the First. I have baby Charles on my list to do. So at some point we will cover his story. But yeah, James had spent his whole life being cautious, and now all the things he worried about is coming home to roost. And he's sick. He must know that he doesn't have very long. He knows he's going to be leaving it to his 20-something-year-old son, who doesn't seem quite cut out for it. You do feel that that is his ultimate tragedy. He is really sick. He can't hunt, which is one of his great loves. He spent too much time drinking. He vomited repeatedly. His mood, too, was not good between the dismal war effort, if you can even call it an effort, and the loss of some of his close friends in that past year. He's really struggling. And the king had been ill so many times that those around him were not worried when he sickened at this point. Still, George, who had been preparing to go to France to do the proxy marriage and continue negotiations, he rode to be with the king. When a plaster or poultice arrived, George, along with his mother Mary, who was there, they put it on King James's wrist against the advice of the doctors. Both James and George were very interested in medicine. George, especially when we had just talked about him being ill, he had gotten especially interested in these plasters and poultices. He's trying to heal his love. He's like, I got this. I don't need the doctors. I'm going to do it. His mom's there to support him. Some people say they put it on his chest, others his wrist. That was also that it could, quote, eat down into his belly without the least hurt or disturbance of nature, end quote. Well, whatever it did, James's condition became worse. According to one account, he went into a coma. Emotions were running high. One of the doctors said, quote, that which was given to the king by the Duke was as bad as poison. That's quite an accusation.
So they're basically saying that George is trying to
poison him,
murder the king.
Yes. And obviously George became irate at that, because that's not a small accusation. That's treason. To do anything against the king, that's treason. We also know that the groom of the bedchamber, Henry Gibb, also insinuated the same thing, that George was poisoning the king, as we're told that George attempted to kick the groom after what he said. And what sounds like a scene out of a dark comedy, I'm just seeing like the death of Stalin. The groom had grabbed George's foot while George was trying to kick him, causing George to fall and hit his head. And then George ran to the sick king, telling him, Justice, sir, I am abused by your servant and wrongfully accused. King James, unable to speak at this point, quote, mournfully fixed his eyes on him, as who would have said, not wrongfully. It's a chilling anecdote, if true. That is what we get to insinuate that King James, when George said, I'm being wrongfully accused, just King James's eyes, because he couldn't speak, saying, not wrongfully. That insinuates that King James thought he was being poisoned.
So this is potentially a total betrayal.
It could be, yeah.
Where did the authors, where did they come down on this? Do they feel it's just speculation, or do they think there was some truth to it?
We'll get into it here in a little bit. Let's kill off James. Can we kill off James first? God, that sounds awful. But can we kill off James first and then talk about it? If you'll allow it.
Okay. All right. Goodbye, Jimmy.
Can I kill the king first? Okay. On the 25th of March, 1625, the king had a stroke. In its aftermath, he suffered greatly. His tongue swelled so much that he could not speak. He was expelling things so grotesque. We're not going to get into the details. It disgusted even the doctors. He had fits that lasted hours. They sound like seizures in the writing. One lasted at least 10 hours. It was not an easy or tranquil end Finally, mercifully, King James I did die on March 27th, 1625. He was 58 years old. We can get into the rumors, the accusations of George poisoning the king, because that does leak out pretty soon, just days after it starts to leak out to the public. There was a pamphlet that came out soon that accused George Villiers of killing the king. We're at a time where there's no newspapers that we think of. This pamphlet culture is very popular. That's their entertainment. People would go and read pamphlets. It was stuff about the court, but also true crime. Here's the grotesque murders that took place in London. We're at the beginning, the printing press had been invented, but we're not quite at newspapers. We do get a pamphlet that accuses George Villiers of killing James, and the pamphlet demanded Parliament to take action against the man who, by means, quote, lawful or unlawful, human or diabolic, tortureth the kingdom. These rumors and accusations, they don't lead anywhere at the time, but you can bet they'd come back to haunt the Duke.
It would be baggage for him going forward.
Yes. If you're asking my opinion, did George Villiers kill King James? I don't think so. There's a chance. Maybe he accidentally sped things up with that plaster and medicine. Though, to be fair, medicine back then was just as likely to kill you faster than to heal you. They contained all kinds of animal parts and things we would now know are toxic. I took a history of medicine class back in college, and oh boy, they bled people, they used leeches. These potions, they weren't filled with good stuff. There's a chance that whatever he gave them could have sped it along. But that said, the king had clearly been in decline prior to his health. We talked through that. This was not a well man. This was a man in his prime, suddenly struck down. Still, if you want to go true crime about it, I love a true crime podcast. So we can turn to that. George did seem to have both motive and opportunity. If he wanted more control over the war effort against Spain, getting the king out of the way would have been convenient. In most cases, a favorite needed their monarch to be alive to continue getting favors, but George had Prince Charles waiting in the wings, and Charles was much more aligned with George in terms of foreign policy. James's death cleared the way for Charles to take the throne and push forward an aggressive new foreign policy agenda, including more war with Spain. So yes, if we look at the evidence, there was motive and opportunity. Again, unfortunately for George, even if nothing happened at that time, the rumors about his involvement, accidental or otherwise, in the king's death would continue to linger in the public consciousness. When Parliament wanted to move against the favorite, they'd have one more accusation to add to the list. And it's a very big accusation. I don't know. Do you think he killed him?
Oh, if you're not willing to commit, I don't know that I should be.
I didn't know with the evidence if you were ready to jump on that.
No, but I think it's a coin flip.
Probably. I don't know. I don't think he did, at least purposefully. And if he had intended to kill the king, he acted the part publicly of a grieving partner. He mourned the death of his benefactor and lover, King James. He was said to have fainted twice on the day of King James's death. Some around him worried that he'd die of grief, die of a broken heart. He obviously wasn't really taking care of himself.
Now, see, this is where I'm suspicious, though, because...
Is he acting too sad, you're saying?
Well, because when they come back from the Spanish match, he becomes this brilliant actor who concocts this whole tale about how, the Spanish had all these demands that just ran counter to my deeply held Protestant/English values, and so
he knew how to play a part, so he could be playing a part.
He knew how to spin.
That is fair.
On the other hand, the only reason, who did he probably learn some of those skills from? He learned them in James's court. So
I mean, they had been together for about a decade. Their relationship had hit a little bit of a rough patch right when he came back, all because of the war with Spain. But They had been devoted to each other up until the end. He was there. He had gone to the king at his deathbed. Although even with the passing of King James, the show had to go on. The king is dead. Long live the king. In this case, the now King Charles I. There was still so much to do, and George Villiers would continue to dominate court and decisions in the years to come. This is where we really do have to stress how unusual, how unthinkable it was for a favorite to span multiple reigns. I've read about a lot of favorites. I can't really think of anyone else who goes over multiple reigns and monarchs. Sir Henry Wotton is quoted as having said, quote, "The state of a favorite is at the best but a tenant at will and rarely transmitted," end quote. But George had thought ahead. He had fostered that relationship with the heir, King Charles as prince, and George had been incredibly close in the waning years of King James, so close as to create that jealousy between father and son. Now, to an inexperienced young king, George suddenly became indispensable. This time around, he was the older and more seasoned figure, the one meant to guide Charles to show him how to wear the crown. Unfortunately, either George passed down all the wrong lessons or Charles I simply ignored whatever scraps of wisdom his favorite tried to offer. You take your pick. If anybody knows how the reign of Charles I goes down, as we've hinted, doesn't end well. George's first mission was to bring home a bride for King Charles. He'll always be baby to me. George went to France in 1625, bejeweled and equal in majesty to any monarch. For a trip that lasted 14 days, a fortnight, he took 27 suits, in addition to countless jewelry, including tons of pearls. Girls, never stress about overpacking again. Favorites, they're just like us. To be fair to George, he was going to attend the proxy wedding between the Princess of France, Henrietta Maria, and King Charles. We have portraits painted at this time that show George positively blinged out the pearls, the drama. I'm going to send you some of the pictures that we get from this time. One of them will be, if you go on Instagram, that is the announcement for this episode. I will post these on Instagram. But if you do search George Villiers, you will see a lot of them in his pearls. You'll probably see the ones that I am sending along.
Wow. You are not kidding. There are a lot of pearls.
Pearls were what aristocrats wore. He's got his little mustache, the tiny little beard.
Yeah, this is a real dry cleaning only moment in the history of Western civilization.
He had 27 suits like that, all for this French marriage. So he's doing pretty well.
Yeah, for somebody who just killed the king, he's doing great.
Ouch. Do you see the front little curls in his hair?
Yeah, he has high maintenance facial hair too.
He had a hairdresser who figured out how to style his hair like that, and he brought him everywhere, as the rich and famous do. I will post these pictures, but those are taken about the time, so you can see what he would look like as he was in France. You only wish that George had spent more time preparing for these intense political negotiations than he did his packing list. George would go up against historical titan, a man I'm sure you know.
I don't know him personally, but I know who you're about to talk about.
Cardinal Richelieu.
Yeah, the great chess player of 18th century Europe.
Yes, so he's going up against him in France to not only get the long-awaited bride for the still incredibly horny King Charles, but to hopefully get France's support either in money or armies to get back the Palatinate and push back against Spanish power. If you thought George Villiers was done with all that after the Mansfeld disaster, you do not know our boy. He is going to keep trying. It's not a bad plan on the face of it. Despite being two Catholic powers in Europe, France did not want Spain to become the preeminent power on the continent. So George is hoping that that would be enough to convince Cardinal Richelieu to join a league against Spain, even if it meant allying itself with Protestant heretics. Their words, not mine.
We won't get into it, but that's an easier calculation for France to make than it is for Spain.
Yes,
So
hypothetically, yes. Cardinal Richelieu, now famous as the ultimate baddie in the Three Musketeers, was not just a holy cardinal concerned only with church business. As chief minister to King Louis XIII, Richelieu didn't just help run France, he became France. He is France. In terms of power, he was king in all but name. Like Olivares before him, the famous Cardinal Richelieu outmatched George Villiers. You gotta feel sorry for George Villiers. He's up against the best of the best. Richelieu refused the requests of the Duke one by one, so in the end, the marriage yielded little tangible results. To quote the book, quote, Buckingham had got Charles a bride, but the alliance that was to have made the marriage politically meaningful had eluded him. For all the gorgeous clothes, the dances, and diamonds, and royal flirtations, he would be going back to England defeated, end quote. All that work, all that time, and all George Villiers in England got was a 15-year-old bride, Henrietta Maria. No promise to ally themselves against Spain in a league against the Spanish Habsburgs. Not even a promise from France that they would not make a peace treaty themselves with Spain. If you're measuring George's diplomatic skills, you could say he's 0-2.
And I think what you're seeing here is that maybe even Richelieu can see that George is not the normal diplomat. George is not your typical negotiator. George is not acting on behalf of some kind of grand strategy in service of his country. He is trying to please the new king. And so he must return across the channel with the bride. He has to do that. And because of that, there's no other.
He doesn't have to give him anything else.
Yep, there's nothing else to negotiate.
Yeah, but this is where you're like, okay, was he the wrong man for the job? Could somebody more experienced, a more experienced diplomat, like our old friend, the Earl of Bristol, could he have gotten results? As important as George Villiers was at court, he does still have little actual diplomatic experience outside of Spain, which that didn't exactly go great for him. Could another person have done better? I don't know if you have any thoughts, but for me, I kind of go back and forth 50-50. I know not in Spain, because the reasons we already mentioned, they were never going to play ball. But in France, I don't know. Maybe you could get one or two concessions. However, Cardinal Richelieu, he's terrifying. He was never going to be bullied into doing anything that he didn't want to do. I don't know if you think that if somebody else had been sent, if they could have gotten something out of Richelieu that Villiers didn't.
I think so. It just because there's a huge menu of controversies that they could try and find some compromise or wiggle room on. Because we need to remember that by this point, the other side of the Atlantic is becoming a pretty complicated place. There are terms they could negotiate in terms of trade, access to the Caribbean, savagely slave markets in West Africa. There's a whole series of things that they could attach to the marriage agreement. You know, the religious wars of the 17th century are still underway. So there's questions about financing Protestant militias or backing Catholics in Habsburg lands. And there's all sorts of things that they probably could have put on the table. But Richelieu knows that George's job is to get the bride, and that's all that really matters.
Yeah. Richelieu, he always had the upper hand in the negotiations, and he was never going to do anything that was not in France's best interests. At least in the Americas, we always think of England as having an outsized impact than it actually did, especially at this time. Later, yes. But at this time, England's just a little dot on the map in the scheme of things. France and Spain, they're the true superpowers. But before we leave France, I do want to return to the Three Musketeers. So if you've read The Three Musketeers by Dumas, I don't think I've read it, but I've seen some of the movies, shows. It's been a while, but George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, does in fact appear. He's there. He's in the book. He's impeccably dressed and beautiful, just as he was in life. In the book, George also has romance with the Queen of France herself, Anne of Austria, which even though her name's Anne of Austria, She's actually the sister of the Infanta that Prince Charles was trying to marry. I just wanted to go into, is that part true? Because I'm sure there are people out there who've consumed some Three Musketeers content, either the book, the movies. I think there was recently a series in the past couple of years.
Yeah, that sounds right.
We don't have any evidence of an outright romance, but it is clear there was at least some flirtation going on when George was in France. Those at court reported gossip and rumors about it. I mean, George was a handsome, suave, well-dressed. The ladies at court swooned when he made his appearance there. If George Villiers oozed sex and glamour, the King of France, Louis XIII, most definitely did not. The book calls him sexually inept. Later, he'd be known for being more attracted to men than women. So it wouldn't be surprising that perhaps Anne of Austria, unhappy in her marriage, flirted with the young Englishman who caught the eye of every lady at court. At one point, while walking together in the gardens, George and Anne had been out of sight for only a minute or two. They were blocked off by some hedges. Anne's attendants were too far behind to see anything. Suddenly, Queen Anne cried out, and they found her flushed, and George was nowhere to be seen. We don't know what happened. Anne did not spill the tea.
Those aren't pearls. Sorry.
Oh my God, Matt, it's filthy. Your mother listens to this.
Sorry.
I apologize.
Oh, it's the 17th century. Yeah, we should probably edit it out.
I'm going to edit this out for your mom's sake.
Put a pause in and we'll do a countdown. Can you keep it together?
No. Okay. So Anne cried. Anne did not spill the tea. We think maybe George had tried to either kiss her or maybe said something a little bit too forward. Of course, this did not help Anglo-French relations. The king was none too pleased. But in terms of a full-blown affair, that juicy little anecdote is about as close as we get. Sorry, that's all we get. George, after all, had to get back to England, back to the king, and back to his family. Catherine, his wife, had just given birth to his first son and heir. The boy had been named Charles after his king. One more quick aside before we leave France, though. It was there that George Villiers saw the Mona Lisa at one of the royal palaces. Of course, it did not have the reputation it does now, but George had wanted it. Remember, he's a huge collector of art. He had been doing a lot of art collecting, both in Spain and in France.
This actually gets him in trouble with Parliament, is all the spending on art.
Yeah, well, in Spain, him and Charles, so Prince Charles, now King Charles, had picked up on that habit. They did a lot of spending in Spain and now in France. The Mona Lisa, now it's the most famous painting in the world. Wasn't at the time, but George had wanted it. Unfortunately, the King of France said no. You flirted with my wife. I like to think Louis told him, you're not getting my Mona Lisa. So he came home, I want to say empty-handed, but he came home not with the Mona Lisa. When George Villiers returned home, French princess in tow, his shine had worn off somewhat. So first, the marriage had dimmed some of George's popularity in England. The populace had cheered and lit bonfires when they had avoided a Spanish princess as Queen of England. And now they're going to be stuck with an equally Catholic French one. Not much of an upgrade. Henrietta Maria was never going to be popular. She refused to renounce her Catholic faith, having promised her mother she never would. She had hoped to ease conditions for Catholics in England. That alone would cause headaches for the rest of her and King Charles's reign. The book indicates that neither King Charles nor his favorite George Villiers had taken into account quite how Catholic their new queen would be. At least the marriage fared better. When George saw the king looking at his new bride, he predicted that he would be soon siring children. That's a quote. Finally, horny baby Charles had an outlet for his sexual frustrations. Thank God. It's the last time I have to talk about him in that way. The marriage itself was one of those rare cases of a happy royal marriage. Charles was faithful, and the two were devoted to each other until his death. It is quite cute. There are some arguments, especially in terms of the Catholicism here right at the beginning, but then they became very steady up until the end. Henrietta Maria. There's a biography that came out in recent years to re-examine her reputation. So she's also on the list. At some point we will cover.
Oh.
The England that George and Henrietta Maria came home to forecasted looming doom. London was beset with plague. By the end of 1625, 1 in 5 Londoners would be dead of plague. No amount of disease, though, was going to get in George and the king's way of launching another strike against Spain. As the saying goes, if first you don't succeed, try again until you're impeached by Parliament and hated by the entire country. That is how it goes, right?
Yeah, mostly. Yeah, I think that's right.
Attempted to be impeached by Parliament.
Right, that never actually happens.
Hated by the entire country, yes. Already, men and supplies were being rounded up. All George and the king needed was money. Easy enough, right? King Charles, baby Charles, called Parliament, hoping for a quick and easy session with more money, more subsidies at the end. He had misjudged the mood of Parliament. Parliament had questions. The early expedition by Mansfield had been a dismal failure. Now more money was needed. Why? They had asked for war with Spain. No, they had shouted for it. And where was that war? To quote one parliamentarian, quote, "The promises and declarations of the last Parliament were in respect of a war. We know yet of no war," end quote. They had given George and the king money before, and look what came of it. Only failure. That was waste of money and no real war. That Mansfield expedition. That's not war. That's just one little thing against Spain. They wanted real war. They, at the very least, wanted an accounting of what had happened with the last money they had provided before giving more. I think fair enough. You have to think about the atmosphere of this Parliament. The plague, and then the unpopular installation of a Catholic princess surrounded by priests and equally Catholic Frenchmen. This was a Protestant God making its displeasure known, at least for those in Parliament. That's how they felt. The book talks about how this Parliament set a pattern that would repeat until George died. It's a longer section, but it's too good to cut. We need to lay out this pattern. The pattern would go like this, quote, "The identification of Buckingham as the root cause of all problems, who must bear the guilt of all that the crown was doing wrong. The initial hesitancy about naming him, and then at last the outpouring of fury against him, the remonstrance, the king taking umbrage, Buckingham begging him to allow Parliament to remain sitting, Charles intransigence," end quote. So it's here, at this Parliament, that the downfall of George Villiers began. It would be a slow dip in the wheel of fortune at first, but soon the wheel would go faster until no one, not even George, could stop it. Of course, it's hard to feel too sympathetic. Guys, we don't just talk about this stuff on the podcast. We talk about it sometimes in our kitchen. And I was telling you earlier that this is where it's really hard to feel sympathetic for him, because George Villiers had every opportunity to pause, reassess, and secure funding before launching unprovoked attacks on the most powerful nation in Europe. He's not just some nameless soldier doomed to these expeditions. He was the one driving them, planning them, launching them with no money and often too late in the year to have success. It's just this lethal mix of hubris and stubbornness. To steal a quote from John Hackett, who's one of George's contemporaries, quote, "To show the greatness of his power, George Villiers made haste to destroy himself," end quote. It gets right to it. He never sees the errors of his way, is the problem.
But, to this point in his life, every stumble, every catastrophe, he's been able to flip into a great success. He spins the Spanish match as, well, he's the one who
comes out on top,
starts the fireworks on October 5th, and then he loses his great benefactor in James, or maybe he even advances or speeds up the departure of James. But he's got Charles there waiting for him. He apparently does something handsy while he's in Paris, but doesn't pay a price for it.
It's
and
true.
Comes back with with the object of the mission. So I don't know. I can kind of see what's happening.
It's true
for
at
him
this
here.
point, but we're going to get into it. There's going to be several instances where you're like, why did this man not stop? Right here, yeah, I see your points. But at some point, I think even you are going to have it up to here with George Villiers. As much as George and the king wanted quick cash, Parliament wasn't playing along. The speeches made it clear their call for an inquiry into how the last Parliament's funds had been spent was really about one thing. Well, one person, the Duke of Buckingham, George Villiers. And honestly, they had a point. They reminded everyone that the office of Lord Admiral, now in George's hands, had once been reserved for men of, quote, greatest trust and experience, not young, unskillful persons. Hard to argue with that. I'm with Parliament on this one. They were still skirting around outright naming George Villiers, knowing it would cause the king to dismiss Parliament, but everyone knew who they meant. I don't think there's any great surprise who they're talking about. Before things could go further or any new funds granted, Parliament had to shut down. The plague was getting worse. Thousands of people were dying each week in London. It would be just a month later that King Charles called Parliament again, eager to get his money. He didn't last time, so calls it again. He called it an Oxford, making the members of Parliament travel, bringing with them plague. So Parliament's a true super spreader event. We know all about this thanks to COVID. George left his pregnant wife, Catherine, behind to monitor things. He was just as desperate for funding as the king. The sooner the better. He was already spending his own money outfitting ships. But Parliament still had the same question. What happened to the last money? They wanted war with Spain, so where was the action? To King Charles and George, the answer was obvious. We don't have any money. That's what we need. At last, Parliament stopped playing coy and began to name names. The money, the unpopular French marriage, the poor planning. It could all be traced back to one man, the Duke of Buckingham, George Villiers. Among those speaking out, surprisingly, was John Eliot, a childhood friend of George's. They'd known each other since their teens in France, and George had even appointed him Vice Admiral of Devon. But after the disaster of the Mansfeld expedition, Eliot had become disillusioned. Now watching George repeat the same mistakes, he felt as if he had a duty to speak out. He saw how the soldiers and sailors were sitting around waiting, their morale dropping. It was consuming money with nothing to show for it. The king was losing patience, to say the least. He sent a message to the House of Commons warning them to speed things up or the fleet would be worthless. If he thought the threat of plague would speed things along, he was wrong. George, for once in his life, thinking through all the consequences, begged the king, falling on his knees to let Parliament air out its grievances if it meant money at the end. He's okay. He knows that they're going to speak ill of him. He's not dumb. He knows what these grievances are, but he thinks, okay, let them do it. We will get money at the end. It's Charles that says no. King Charles once again ended Parliament in 1625 with no money. So we've got two parliaments, no money. The king and the favorite would have to go looking then for other ways to raise money. King James, never a fan of Parliament, had avoided calling it by selling monopolies and titles. We talked about monopolies back in episode 1 and how that got George Villiers and his family into trouble. But remember, James had not been at war. He was a peacetime king. His son needed much more money. George Villiers went so far as to try to pawn the crown jewels. He went overseas to the Dutch. They were like, no, these aren't yours. These are property of the country.
This is state property, right?
Yeah, so he was not able to sell them off. And it was just at that time, just when he thought it could get no worse, that another one of George's horribly planned expeditions blew up in his face. If you're looking for the moment when public patience with him really began to run out, I think this was it. At least this is the start of it. There are some other flashpoints, but this is a big one. He had sent a fleet to go harass Cadiz, a Spanish port city. Francis Drake was famous for raiding Cadiz back in Queen Elizabeth I's reign. He'd just go in and make these little missions in and out. George hoped to replicate that. They're still acting like they were in Elizabeth's golden age. They were playing like they were pretending. The plan was to capture Cadiz, destroy the Spanish fleet, and capture Spain's treasure ships returning from the Americas. The fleet left late in the year, too late. Once again, this is going to repeat over and over again. Many of the sailors didn't even have shirts or shoes. Some didn't even have pants. How do you fight a battle without pants? Tell me that. The storms battered the fleet. The food that they had paid for had been bad. It was already rotten by the time they had gotten out to sea. They had been swindled. When the ships landed near Cadiz, the men found vats of wine and got drunk and sloppy. They started fighting each other. The hangover was even worse. The Spanish treasure ships kept slipping by. They kept seeing them one after another, but then never going after them. Disease killed whatever men were left. Cecil, the ship's expedition leader, had no choice but to head home with the few men he had. No treasure, no results. Nothing but hangovers and about half the men dead. There was not even money to pay the men who survived. There were stories of them just dropping dead in the streets of Plymouth after they returned, starving. You can see how George dragged the English foreign policy along with him, how he got stuck in the cycle. After each failure, he needed to launch another to prove himself and prove the English military prowess. But once stuck in that cycle, it was really hard to get off. He did not figure out a way to stop the cycle. If the Cadiz expedition was supposed to buy George Villiers some time and goodwill, it backfired. Parliament was ready to make him the scapegoat. We're going to end there today.
Oh boy, you've got him on a cliff now.
I know.
How's he going to spin his way out
I really
of
wanted
this?
to do 2 parts, but we have a big Parliament battle ahead of us, so I didn't want to condense it. So it's going to be a 3-parter. I do have the script for part 3 pretty much ready. So since you guys had to wait longer than expected for this one, I hope to get part 3 out soon, probably later this week. We will explore in that one the attempted impeachment of George Villiers, even more military failures. You know it wasn't going to end there. And conclude George's story at an inn in Plymouth. So thank you guys for listening. As always, if you like this episode, like this podcast, rate, subscribe. You can contact us on Instagram or via our email. I think all that's in the show notes, especially if there are people that you want us to cover. Otherwise, we will talk to you soon.
Very soon, just in a couple of days.
Yes, and hear the rest of George Villiers' short life. So, bye, guys.
Bye, everybody.